After Hurricane Katrina ravaged a neighborhood in New Orleans, an elderly, soft-spoken black pastor chose to stay behind and rebuild his ruined church. One evening, while sweeping the front yard, he saw a thin, hungry boy sleeping on a stone bench in the courtyard. Without hesitation, he brought the child inside, gave him food, and taught him how to read and count until the church was forced to close. Years later, the boy returned, not just to repay the kindness, but to rebuild the shelter that once saved him. Have you ever experienced a hurricane or natural disaster? Share your story in the comments below. In the battered remnants of post-Katrina New Orleans, just months after the hurricane had torn through the city with merciless force, ripping roofs from homes, flooding neighborhoods, and silencing once vibrant communities. The air remained thick with stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Buildings sagged under the weight of water damage and time. Power lines hung like limp threads across cracked sidewalks, and the joyous echoes of brass bands and front porch conversations had been replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to settle deep into the bones of the place. Amid this solemn landscape stood the broken shell of a small Baptist church, its steeple fractured, its pews warped from rain, and its stained glass shattered into colorful fragments that no longer held sunlight. Inside this wounded sanctuary moved Reverend Hyle, a man in his 60s whose body had grown lean with age and labor, and whose eyes, though tired, still carried a gentle clarity that no storm had managed to extinguish. He hadn't fled when the floodwaters rose or when neighbors packed their belongings and boarded evacuation buses. He had remained, not from stubbornness or pride, but because he believed that sacred spaces, even broken ones, should not be abandoned when they were needed most. Each morning, Hylas swept away fallen plaster and dead leaves from the sanctuary floor, straightened the few remaining hymnals on splintered shelves, and read aloud from the Bible, not to a congregation, but to the air, the light, and perhaps, in some way, to the soul of the church itself. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that he first noticed the boy, a slight, wiry child curled up tightly on a stone bench just beyond the broken window arch, his knees tucked under his chin, arms wrapped around his thin frame in a way that suggested he was doing his best to disappear. The boy, no more than 10 years old, wore clothing that had stiffened with grime, and his face, gaunt and drawn, revealed more than just hunger. It revealed a kind of quiet vigilance, a haunted alertness common among children who had seen too much too soon. Riley observed the boy from a distance over the next few days, saying nothing, simply noting how the child would appear near dusk and slip quietly into the very back of the church, seating himself on the farthest pew where shadows clung thickest. He never made a sound, never bowed his head or raised it, never sang or spoke. But he listened intently, without blinking, as Hiley read passages of Scripture aloud into the fractured air. Understanding the fragility of that kind of silence, Hiley refrained from approaching too quickly or speaking too soon, aware that children who'd learned to survive on the streets did not respond well to pressure or pity. But one evening, after finishing a reading from the Psalms, he paused, looked up from the worn pages, and let his eyes settle gently on the boy. "You come here often," he said, his voice soft, steady, not asking but noting. The boy flinched slightly, clearly startled, and when he looked up, his wide, dark eyes were filled not with rebellion or resentment, but with fear. The kind that wasn't loud or theatrical, but deep, quiet, and old. Hiley took a small step forward, his movements unhurried, and continued. "You hungry, son? I've got some soup on the stove. It's just potatoes and onions, not much to brag about, but it's warm and it's food." There was no immediate reply, but after a long pause the boy slowly stood, his limbs stiff from sleep or caution, and followed Hyle into the church. The makeshift kitchen in the side room, once an office lined with bookshelves, now held a hot plate, a stack of mismatched bowls, and a scattering of canned goods. Hyle ladled the soup into a chipped ceramic bowl, placed it gently on the table, and stepped back without another word. The boy sat down and ate with a kind of silent desperation that told Hyle it had been days, maybe longer, since his last proper meal. When the bowl was empty and the child finally looked up, Hyle simply nodded and said, "You can come here whenever you need to. There's no lock on the door, just knock if it's late." That night, the boy didn't leave. Hale gathered a few hymnals, laid them down with a folded sheet as a makeshift mattress, and the child, without asking, without speaking, curled up and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, his body finally letting go of whatever had been holding it tense and upright for so long. In the nights that followed, this pattern became a rhythm, one that neither of them broke. The boy, whose name Hala would later learn was Malik, returned each evening. At first it was only for food and rest, but soon he began sitting closer during the readings, then staying after to help sweep or wipe down dusty surfaces. Hala never pushed, never asked for more than the boy was willing to give. One evening, he pulled out a well-worn children's Bible and asked gently, "You know how to read?" Malik shook his head. "Well then," Hale replied, pulling up a chair beside him, "you sit there and I'll read to you." And so, their quiet lessons began. Not just in scripture, but in language, in numbers, in the kind of foundational skills a boy would need to navigate a world that had not done him any favors. Every evening after the dishes were washed and the air turned cooler, Hyla would set 2 wooden chairs side by side beneath the last working lantern in the church, its flickering yellow light casting long shadows across the cracked floorboards. On the table between them sat a stack of dog-eared books, a box of pencils worn down to nubs, and a small slate board salvaged from the back of a shuttered schoolhouse. Malik would climb into his seat carefully, knees pulled close, eyes alert but no longer suspicious, and Haile would clear his throat gently like a teacher ready to begin a humble but holy ritual. They started with the alphabet. Not the bright and cheerful kind that decorated classroom walls, but letters scribbled patiently by Hilly onto a sheet of faded notebook paper. He'd sound them out one by one, tapping the page with a gnarled finger. "A," he'd say slowly, "like apple or almond." Malik would repeat it softly, his voice thin but steady. They would do this again and again, night after night, until the letters became muscle memory in his hand and sound in his chest. When the letters began to form words, Haile would smile quietly as Malik traced his own name for the first time, each letter shaky but determined. Malik. The boy stared at it for a long moment, as though seeing himself on paper made something inside him more real, more possible. Haile didn't praise him loudly or clap. He simply nodded, then said, "Now, sign it again, but this time like you mean it belongs to you." Malik did, straighter, firmer, and with the beginnings of pride. And as the days passed, something shifted. Malik no longer slouched in his chair or kept his gaze low. He began sitting upright, shoulders square, answering questions with confidence, sometimes even offering thoughts before being asked. He wasn't loud, but he was present, fully, unmistakably present. In that quiet corner of a crumbling church, lit by a lantern that hummed and buzzed like a firefly trapped in glass, a boy who once clung to shadows was slowly, steadily, being taught how to stand in the light. One evening, as they sat under the flickering light of a battery-powered lamp, Malik finally spoke in more than a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice flat but honest. Haile didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly in his chair, looked the boy in the eyes, and answered with calm clarity, "Because no one deserves to be left behind." That was all. It wasn't a sermon or a story, just a truth spoken plainly, and for Malik, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the boy began to change. Not in any dramatic way, but in small, steady gestures. He smiled once or twice. He stopped flinching at every sudden sound. He began humming as he swept the floors, and in the heart of that broken church, surrounded by cracked windows and crumbling walls, something unexpected began to grow. Not out of miracles, not out of wealth or rescue, but out of consistency, kindness, and the quiet decision of one man to care, even when no one else was watching. As the days folded into weeks, and the fragile bond between Haile and Malik began to take root in something more solid than circumstance, the old church, though still crumbling and bare, started to hum with a quiet purpose. It was no longer just a shelter from rain or a relic left behind by better days. It became, in its own worn-down way, a classroom, a sanctuary, and a home stitched together by shared silence and soft words. Haile, though never one to speak needlessly, had a way of filling a room with meaning even in stillness, and Malik, once wary of eye contact and quick to flinch at sudden sounds, now met each evening with quiet anticipation, as though the hours after sunset held a rhythm only the two of them understood. They had fallen into a pattern that made the days feel steady again. Dinner, lessons, scripture, and sometimes just sitting beside one another as the wind rustled through the cracked window panes and the city groaned softly in the distance, still trying to remember how to breathe. It was during one of those evenings, just after Malik had successfully read a full paragraph from the book of Matthew without stumbling, that Haile leaned back in his chair, rubbing his knuckles where the cold had begun to settle into the bone, and looked at the boy with something deeper than pride. "You're not just memorizing words," he said, voice low and rough with age. "You're carrying them. That's different. Anyone can repeat a thing, but when you carry it, it lives inside you. It changes the way you walk through the world." Malik nodded, not fully grasping the weight of the words, but sensing, in the stillness that followed, that something important had been passed to him. By then he had begun to help Haile with the little repairs around the church, nothing grand, but small, persistent acts, clearing leaves from the front steps, wiping down the old pulpit, nailing boards over broken windows to keep out the worst of the weather. Haile never told him what to do, never treated him like an errand boy or a project, but instead offered each task as if entrusting a piece of something sacred. "This building's tired," he'd say while handing Malik a hammer, "but it's still standing, just like some people." Malik had begun to speak more too, not in long speeches but in short, thoughtful phrases, questions mostly, about the Bible, about words he didn't understand, about the world outside the broken doors they rarely ventured beyond. One evening, as they sat on the stoop watching dusk gather in the sky like a slowly dimming flame, he asked, "Do you think God forgot about me?" The question came not with bitterness but with the aching honesty of a child who'd seen too much too soon. Ali didn't answer right away. He simply sat beside the boy, folded his hands over his knees, and said softly, "If God forgot you, you wouldn't be here, and neither would I." But the peace they had woven together, fragile as it was, could not shield them from the slow press of the outside world. As winter crept in and the city's reconstruction trudged forward, eyes began to turn toward the neglected corners that had been left untouched for too long. The church, with its leaning walls and unsecured roof, soon drew the attention of city inspectors and relief organizations tasked with relocating the remaining displaced residents. One morning, as Haile sorted canned goods in the back, two men arrived with clipboards and solemn expressions, speaking in tones too polite to be comforting. They informed him that the structure had been declared unsafe and that arrangements were being made to clear the site within the month. "We understand this place means something to you," one of them said carefully, "but we can't ignore the risk any longer. It's not habitable, it's barely standing." Haile nodded, saying little. He had known this moment would come. He watched them leave, their footsteps fading like an echo that had no intention of returning. That evening, when Malik returned from gathering kindling, Haile sat him down at the small table where they shared their meals and lessons, and gently broke the news. The boy didn't say a word. He only stared at the worn floorboards, his fingers curling around the edge of the chair as if trying to hold on to something slipping from beneath him. After a long silence, he looked up and asked with trembling certainty, "They're going to take it down?" Haile nodded, then reached across the table, not to correct or comfort, but to steady. "Yes, they will. But it's just a building, Malik. What we built inside it, that stays." A few days later, a representative from a children's outreach program arrived, explaining that arrangements had been made for Malik to be taken into a residential care center for orphaned youth on the other side of the city. They had beds, warm food, school programs, books, even counselors trained to help children who had been through trauma. The woman spoke with kindness and good intentions, but Hailey could see the fear rising again in Malik's eyes. The kind of fear that comes not from danger itself, but from the uncertainty of being passed along like an unwanted parcel. That night, as they sat by the flickering lamp, Hailey laid a small satchel on the table. Inside were a few folded shirts, a paperback children's Bible, and a carefully wrapped peanut butter sandwich. He didn't speak for a long time, but when he finally did, his voice was calm and low. "You've got more ahead of you than what I can give. I've taught you what I know, but they can teach you things I can't. They've got new books, real teachers, clean beds. You deserve all of that and more." Malik looked down, blinking hard, his hands clenched tight on his lap. "I don't want to go," he whispered. "I want to stay with you." Hailey reached across the table and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, not to insist, not to persuade, but to let him know that the love between them wasn't tied to a building or a city or a routine. "You've grown, Malik. At the center they'll have new books, full meals, warm beds, and a future waiting for you. As for me, I don't have anything more to give, not many words left to teach, not a dime to offer. But you can carry with you what I believe. You deserve a life far bigger than this broken little shelter ever could be." "I'll never leave you, Malik," he said softly. "Not here?" He tapped his own chest. "You'll carry me, just like you've been carrying those words, and wherever you go, I'll be with you." And so, on a cold morning wrapped in fog and the hush of unspoken goodbyes, Malik boarded the transport van with a satchel in his lap, and his heart cracked open in a way he didn't yet understand. Hailey stood on the church steps, shoulders back, hands clasped in front of him, and watched as the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared. He didn't wave. He didn't cry. He simply stood still, the wind tugging gently at his coat, and whispered under his breath to no one and to God, "Take care of him, he's a good boy." The years that followed unfolded slowly, like a long southern afternoon where nothing seemed to move, and yet everything quietly changed. Time, as it often does, pulled Malik and Reverend Hael onto separate paths, one marked by books and bright corridors and structured days inside the children's center, the other by silence and the steady creak of an old rocking chair inside a rented room, a few blocks from where the church once stood. They did not speak again for a long time. Life, with all its momentum and detours, had a way of stretching distance between people, even when memory kept them close. Still, Hailey never forgot the boy with the steady eyes and the name he had learned to write with such care, and Malik never let go of the voice that had told him, more than once, that he mattered. At the center, Malik adjusted slowly. He didn't smile much in the beginning, and rarely raised his hand in class, but he listened, just as he had in the old church pews, and he learned. He read everything he could find, copying paragraphs into his notebook late into the night under the narrow light of his dorm lamp, as if he were still sitting beside Hailey. When asked where he had learned to read, he simply said, "An old man with a Bible and a tin pot of soup." Most didn't understand, but one teacher, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, took the answer and smiled, like she knew exactly the kind of man he meant. Malik grew, not just in inches, but in clarity. He discovered he was good with numbers, better with logic, and best of all when something needed fixing. He won scholarships, earned degrees, started a company that built technology designed to help people navigate disaster response, so others might find the help he once did not know how to ask for. He wore suits now, flew across cities, stood behind podiums and answered questions from men twice his age. But every time he wrote his name on a dotted line or signed a contract, he remembered the way Hailey had told him to do it. Like you mean it belongs to you. Success found him, but he never chased the kind that glitters loudly. He had seen enough empty shine in the floodwaters of New Orleans to know that not all gold is worth holding. He kept his generosity quiet, his accomplishments grounded, and yet something remained unfinished, an ache tucked deep beneath his ribs that stirred every time he passed a church, heard gospel music, or saw a young boy walking alone with his head down and his hands shoved deep into pockets that held more fear than coins. 15 years after that morning he had climbed into the back of the van with a satchel in his lap and tears drying on his cheeks. Malik returned to New Orleans, not for business, not for a keynote speech, but for something older and truer. The streets had changed, some for better, others for worse. Condos now stood where shotguns once lined up like crooked teeth, and coffee shops hummed where there had once been silence. But when he turned onto the block where the church used to be, he stopped the car and simply sat still, staring at the empty lot that now held nothing but weeds and a rusted fence. He got out, walked slowly to the chain-link gate, and gripped it with both hands, as if expecting the gate to open into the past. It didn't, of course. The sanctuary was gone, the steps were gone, the crooked bell tower was nothing but a memory. But, standing there, he could still hear the clatter of Hale's boots on the floorboards, the scrape of a spoon against a chipped bowl, and the soft rumble of that voice that had once told him, "You deserve a life far bigger than this broken little shelter ever could be." It took him weeks to find Haile. He wasn't listed in any phone book, didn't have a social media profile, didn't appear in search results. But Malik was not a boy anymore, and he had learned how to find what mattered. Eventually, through a retired pastor who remembered the man who stayed when everyone else had left, Malik located him in a modest room at a long-term care facility just outside the city. One of those quiet places where days blend into each other and the world forgets the people it once leaned on. Hale was older now, smaller somehow, the weight of years having pressed his shoulders into a permanent slope. His hair was white and thin, and his hands trembled slightly as he folded them in his lap. But when Malik stepped into the room, everything stilled. Haile looked up, and for a moment he simply stared. Then, with a voice softened by time but still unmistakably his own, he said, "Well now, look what the Lord went and did." Malik smiled, walked forward, and knelt beside the old man's chair. He took Hailo's hand, the same hand that had once placed soup before him, that had taught him how to hold a pencil, and said, "I came back, Reverend. I didn't forget. And I've built something, but I need your help to finish it." Hale's eyes lit with quiet joy, the kind that doesn't come from surprise, but from the quiet fulfillment of a promise long kept. "Tell me what you need," he whispered. And Malik told him about rebuilding the church, not just with wood and stone, but with purpose, about creating a place for children like he once was, a place with meals and warmth and names spoken with love. He described a center for learning, a shelter for spirit, a sanctuary born not out of charity, but of remembrance. And Haile, though his voice shook and his body was tired, smiled the kind of smile that had once held up walls. "Then let's build it," he said, his hand still resting in Malik's, "one soul at a time." The rebuilding did not begin with blueprints or press releases or golden shovels breaking ceremonial ground. It began with two men, one old and weathered by time, the other grown but still carrying the quiet tenderness of a boy once lost. Sitting across from each other in a sunlit room, talking not about legacy or reward, but about service, about dignity, and about the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. Malik spared no effort. He returned to the city with purpose stitched into every step, gathering a team that understood this was not a business venture but something closer to sacred work. He walked the same streets he once feared, stood on the same patch of ground where the old church had crumbled, and promised himself that what they would build here would not just be stronger in structure, but deeper in spirit. He didn't want grandeur. He wanted warmth. He didn't want spectacle. He wanted a door that stayed open. It took months of planning and quiet negotiation, of zoning hurdles and meetings with city officials who remembered the storm only in headlines, but not in the lives it shattered. Malik remained steady. He visited Haile often, bringing him updates in the form of drawings, photos, stories. The old man, though slower now and resting more than he stood, remained the project's beating heart. On days when doubt tried to creep in, Malik would sit beside him and let Haley's voice, even raspy and thin, remind him why it mattered. "You're not building a building," Haley told him one gray afternoon, his hand wrapped in a blanket. "You're restoring a promise." When the first bricks were laid, Malik brought Haley to the site. He arranged for a quiet morning, no speeches, no press, just the two of them and a few workers pausing as the car rolled up. Haley stepped out with care, leaning heavily on Malik's arm, and when he saw the wooden frame beginning to rise from the earth where the sanctuary once stood, his lips parted in silent reverence. He stood for a long time without speaking, then whispered, "It's still holy ground." Months turned into seasons. What emerged on that once abandoned lot was not just a church, but a beacon. The new building held the soft warmth of pine wood and the steady strength of brick, but more than that, it held intention in every corner. There was a sanctuary with sunlight spilling through tall, clear windows, no stained glass, just open light. There was a kitchen, simple but capable, where meals would be served without charge and without judgment, appreciated in the culture. And beside it all stood the heart of the vision, the Malik and Haley Community Learning Center, a space built not just for education, but for restoration. Children came in slowly at first, some with guardians, others with caseworkers, a few alone with questions in their eyes and shoes too big for their feet. They were greeted not by lectures, but by smiles. Inside they found shelves of books that smelled new, pencils still sharp, and tables that didn't wobble. They found tutors who listened, meals that filled their bellies, and volunteers who learned their names. They found something that Malik himself had once needed more than anything, a place to sit without fear, to learn without shame, to be seen without being judged. Malik spent time there as often as he could. He walked the halls not as a man to be applauded, but as a presence, calm and steady. He knelt beside children learning their letters, handed out sandwiches on rainy days, and sat in the sanctuary late at night when no one else was around, remembering the echo of Hyla's boots on old floorboards, the flicker of a single lantern, and the taste of onion soup in winter. Hyla, for as long as his health allowed, came too. He would sit in a high-backed chair by the center's front window, wrapped in his favorite brown cardigan, offering nods and words of encouragement, telling stories when asked, but mostly just being there. A living reminder that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Even as his body slowed, his spirit remained rooted in every child who walked through the door and every volunteer who wiped down a desk or packed a lunch. In time, the city began to notice. Not because of headlines, but because fewer children wandered the streets alone, fewer dropped out of school, fewer arrived at shelters with nowhere else to go. What had been born from one man's compassion and another's promise had become something greater than both, a testament to what it means to be held, taught, fed, and seen. And then, one autumn afternoon, beneath the long shadows of golden trees, Haley passed quietly in his sleep. Malik was by his side, holding his hand, whispering prayers through tears that did not fall loudly, but with the deep ache of a soul paying respect to its foundation. There was no grand funeral, only a service in the sanctuary they had built together, attended by those whose lives had been quietly changed by a bowl of soup, a book, a steady hand. Malik spoke only once that day, standing in the center aisle, his voice steady but soft. "He didn't save the world," he said, looking out at the gathered faces. "He just didn't walk away from it. And because of that, I never had to walk alone." Outside, the bell rang for the first time, not as a call to service, but as a celebration of a life that had planted seeds in broken ground. The children, those who had known Hylia and those who had only heard his name in the stories whispered across the halls, stood in a line beneath the oak tree and sang softly, their voices rising like prayer. And when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to gold, Malik sat on the same front steps where he had once learned to read, looked up at the cross carved into the new stone, and smiled, not because the work was done, but because the light was still burning. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.